web development. Today's lesson is going to be a purely practical session. We will work with superglobals in PHP. In our previous lesson, we covered all the theory bits. Now, this is going to be the final lesson in this module before we move forward with our next lesson in our next module, and we'll start working with SQL databases. Okay, so let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. Essentially, the objectives is just one objective, and that is working with superglobals in PHP using a practical approach. So without further ado, I think it's time that we can jump right in and we can start to code. Now, the first thing we want to ensure is that we have our Atom booted up, and we want to make sure that our XAMPP control panel is running. That is our Apache server and our MySQL database. For the most part, we are going to be using the MySQL database in our next lesson. So let's minimize all of this and let's get started. I need to create a new script, and I'm first going to save this untitled script as something that we can work with. And I would say something like L8-1.php. I'll save this, and I can write some boilerplate code for my document. So let's minimize this. Let's actually delete all of this and create a proper HTML boilerplate. And in our tags over here is where we'll create new code. So I'm going to create an h2 tag of superglobals that we have some point of reference. And then I'm going to create my PHP tag. Now, once that's done, I can start writing out my PHP code. So the first thing I want to work with is our globals. We've worked with globals before, but I'm going to show you how we can use the superglobal global. Okay, so I'm going to create a new variable called num1, and I'm going to set this equal to 50, and then I'm going to create another variable called num2, and I'm going to set this equal to 10. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to create a function, and this function is just going to be a multiplication function called multiply. We've seen this before. And I need to open my curly brace and pass in the block of code. Now, this is where the trick comes in. I'm going to create a variable called globals in this block of code over here. So it's going to be called globals. But this is essentially going to be a global with a key value pair of result. So let's just use small caps over here. And I'll explain what I'm doing in a second. Then I'm going to set this equal to globals. We can actually just copy this. I'm going to set this equal to num1, and I'm going to multiply this by globals. And the key value pair for this one is going to be num2. So I'll say num2, close this off. And there we go. Let's save it up. And now I need to go and call this function. Okay, so I'm going to say outside of my curly brace over here, I'm going to simply just call this function by saying multiply and keep in mind that we are not echoing anything at the moment, which is fine, because the point of this is to show you how we can actually work with globals in a really nifty way. I'm going to call globals again, and here I simply just want to print the result. Let's just add a break tag in case for a new line. Let's save this up, and now let's head over to Chrome and let's load this up. So let's say localhost L8-1, I believe it was, .php. And now if we load this, we get a value of 500. Now, what exactly is going on over here? Well, it's fairly simple if you think about it. Because we are working with globals, we can actually reference these global results outside of the scope where they are being created. Think about it like this. We've got num1 and num2 that's created globally initially, and that's fine because we can reference them here. But here we have another global with a key value pair called result stored within a function. So you would think that this is actually a local variable over here. But because we specified the keyword globals, because we're working with the superglobal class over here, we can actually access this outside of the function which is what's happening here. So we performed the multiplication and we've given the result superglobal, the multiplication of num1 and num2 superglobal, which is 50 and 10. Thus we get 500. And then we echo out that result, which is this over here. So the point here is that regardless of being locally scoped within this function, we can create a global inside a function and still call that global at a later stage. Pretty interesting, right? We can take this a step further and we can actually create a function that returns something using this result. Let's take a look at how we do that. Now, to achieve this, I'm going to create another function over here, and this function is simply going to be called function add, and this will take in one parameter of value. So over here, I'll add my parameter value. Again, you can name this parameter whichever value you would like, or you could give this whatever name you would like to give it. And then over here, I'm just going to run a simple return statement, and the goal here is to return some sort of value. So I'll say globals again. I want you to return the result, which we know is going to be 500 after running the multiplication function or multiply function over here. Let's just put this in parentheses. We know this is going to be 500, but then I also want you to add whatever value the user passes in over here. Pretty neat, right? So let's just close this off, clean up our code nicely. And I'm simply just going to echo my add function. So I'll say echo add, and what am I going to pass in? Simply just the number 50. Let's run this and make sure we have break tags when needed. Perfect. Let's actually just rerun this, and now we get 550. So again, let's review this for a second. So essentially what happened is we created the multiply function. We know that we can create it locally. Well, that is to say we can create a global variable locally simply by using the superglobal globals, and then we can work with that value at some stage outside of the function, which is what we are doing here as well as here. We echoed the result of this, and then we took it a step further and we took that result, which was 500, and we created this add function over here, which takes in one parameter. We added 50, and thus we add the 50 to the 500, and we print out 550. Pretty neat stuff. So next, I actually want to work with the server superglobal. This one is very, very easy to understand. Now, as we mentioned in our previous lesson, the server superglobal just allows you to retrieve any information relating to the server that you are working on. In our case, we are working on a localhost. So I'm going to remove all of this code over here so we can start from scratch. I'll save this. And I'm going to create my first superglobal by calling echo $_ server in capital letters. And then I'm going to call PHP _ self. And I'll add a break tag to this to create a new line for the rest of the server details we're going to call at a later stage. We also need to make sure that this is in quotation marks. Let's save this up and see what we get. So I'll get back over, refresh, and we can actually see we get this thing called /l1-1.php. And if you recall, this is actually the file that we created. So the idea behind this piece of code, behind server self or server PHP self, it just gives you information about the script that we're working with itself, the name of that script, okay? Keep that in mind. So what else can we do? I'm going to copy and paste this, and we'll just change our little string over here, and we'll call server name instead, _name, save this. Do keep in mind that you have to write them exactly as is over here, okay? Because these are built-in superglobals. So I'll save this again, head back over. We've got an error, and that is most likely because we forgot a semicolon, which we did. So PHP is very, very finicky when it comes to your semicolon. So always try to keep in mind that you have to add them if you have several lines of code. So let's head back over, refresh this, and now I can see that I'm working on my local host, and that is exactly the case. I can actually see in my URL over here that my server name is localhost. So what else can we do with the server superglobal? Let's actually try a couple of other examples. So I'll copy this, I'll paste this over here, and now I'll call document root. Save this, hit back over, refresh, and I can get the exact directly from the C drive where my script is located. So here we have the script name, and here we have the exact path as to where that script is located. Let's try one more, and let's work with server port. So I'll paste this line over here, and I'll simply call server port over here. So let's say server port, save, hit back over, and see what we get. And I get this value of 80. So where do I get this value, and how do I know that this is the port that I'm working on? Well, if you remember from a couple of the early lessons in PHP, we worked with our control panel, and we can actually see over here that my Apache server is running on port 80. So why is all of this important, and how can we use the server superglobals? Well, again, if we need to retrieve any information pertaining specifically to our server, we can use these superglobals in the event that we want to do some sort of computation. And that's basically when it comes to server superglobals. Now, I want to work on the next part, which is really, really important. This is going to be the get, the post, and the session superglobals. So I'll delete all of this once again, save my file. Now, I'm simply just going to include a form inside of my code. And if you remember from our early lessons in HTML, creating a form is very, very easy. We could either do something like just type in the keyword form over here, and we'll generate some boilerplate form code. We, of course, do need to include things like our input fields and buttons. But because I have one prepared already, I'm just going to go ahead and paste this in over here. So let's run through this form. This form is just called a get form. That's data 2. And the method over here currently is blank, which is empty. And then we have an input of text type, and the name of this is input1 with a placeholder of username. And then we simply have a submit button over here. The button type is submit, and the name of the button is button. Let's save this and see what it looks like. So if I refresh my code over here, I simply just get this h2 tag with one input field and a submit button. Now let's head back over to this, and let's actually start coding out our logic. Now, below my form over here, I have an empty set of PHP tags. And between these two tags is where I'm going to write the logic for my form. So I'm going to create an if statement over here, and I'm going to call if is set. I'll explain what this means in a second. Let's just get the logic down first. I'm going to create this thing called get, and I'm going to pass in an input over here that is going to be of input -1, and then I will create my logic for what needs to happen if this is the case. Before we do that though, let's just clear up what get means and what eset means. Now, from our previous lesson, when we are working with the get superglobal, we are requesting information, and we can do that by requesting information in a URL. The eset function over here, if we have a look at the documentation, is just a way to determine if a variable is declared or not. So in essence, is the variable a null, which is empty, or is the variable been, or has the variable been assigned some sort of value? We can even go and have a look on W3 Schools, which I think also does a great job of demonstrating how all of this works, the definition and the usage. So the eset function checks whether a variable is set or not. In essence, that's what we can gather from this. And that is what I'm using the eset function for. Why am I doing this though? Because currently as it stands, we don't have any information set in this field over here. So as a safety check to avoid any errors, I just want to make sure that I'm checking first before I perform any sort of logic. And what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to echo out that get. So this variable over here, we can actually just copy and paste this because this is an array if you think about it. I'm going to copy this, paste this in over here. And I'm essentially going to grab the value that the user put in here. Now, in order for all of this to work, there's one last thing we need to do. We need to make sure that we are calling the get method for this form. If we leave this out, this is simply not going to work. So I'm going to include the get method over here. I'll save this up. Let's double check our logic one more time. So if is set, that is to say, if the value is set in this input field over here, if there is a value and the user presses the submit button, then echo this out. Okay, that seems fairly straightforward. We can also add a break tag over here. So dot break tag. Let's save this up and let's hit back and let's refresh our page. And I'm going to pass in some name over here, which is just going to be something like Steven. And if I hit submit, you'll notice that at the top over here in my URL, I'm actually able to pass in data in my URL. So I can actually work with this data at some stage. I can take this data and I can plug it into a database, or I can do some sort of computation with it. You'll notice that button is equal to nothing because we don't have a value for the button. But as long as we have this value over here, if there is a relevant value over here, we can perform some sort of computation with the value Steven that was put in this input field, input-1. We've also managed to print that out to the bottom over here. Now, what if we wanted to work with two values, and how would that work with our URL over here? Let's take a look. So I'm going to head back over to my script, and I'm going to create another input field. You can actually just copy and paste this one, and below this break tag, I'm going to add this line. And then I'm going to add another break tag. Also take note that my HTML code is actually outside of my PHP code. Okay, very, very important. So this one over here, I'm going to call something like mail maybe, or email, whatever you want to call it. Go right ahead. And I'm going to change this to input-2. Now, we need to handle the logic for this. So I'm also going to copy this over here because I want to echo out the input-2 field. And then there's one more thing we have to do. We have to work on our conditional logic because we want to make sure both of these fields have data and they are not blank. So how do we do that? We can simply just revisit our if statement over here, and we can add additional logic that's going to say, okay, so check input 1, but also check input 2. So just over here within my if block, I can see that this is the closing tag for my if block over here. So just over here, I'm going to add double ampersand is set. We can actually just copy and paste this. So if is set, we can paste this here, and we can change this to 2. And let's save this. Let's revisit our code one more time. So if is set input 1 with the get method is not blank, which means there is a value, and is set is input 2, which is also on the get method, essentially saying if both of these fields are not blank, then go ahead and do this bunch of code over here. Great. So now that we've double checked everything, we can save this up one more time, revisit our form, and I'll say Steven once again, and I'll say test@gmail.com. If I hit submit, you'll notice that I now get two values that are printed out. But at the top over here, my input-1 input is equal to Steven, and you'll notice that I have another piece of string over here that says input-2 is equal to test@gmail.com. Okay, this is just our URL's way of handling @signs, just to keep that in mind as well. So we've got two input values that we can work with here that we can actually pull from our URL and do some sort of computation with. Now, this brings us on to the post method. So I'll just head back over, and we can actually maintain this code for the time being, and we'll essentially just optimize it. Or we can just delete all of it and then re-optimize it. I think I'm going to start from scratch, and we'll just remove all of this and paste the post form that we're going to work with. So this is going to be my post form with an h2 tag of post form. The method, once again, is blank. We only have one input field called input3, username, and a submit button over here. Great. And then we have our if is set function or conditional statement that we have to get rid of because we kind of want to start from scratch. So I'll delete this over here, and then I'll save this up. Let's see what our form looks like. It's pretty much going to look exactly the same as before with just a username and a different header2 tag. So let's hit back. And I'm going to create the logic. And as you may notice, the logic for the most part is going to be the same. Over here, I'm going to call the post method instead of the get method. and I'll explain why in a second. So in my PHP, I need to write my conditions. So if, let's just create our curly brace, if is set, over here, I'm going to have $_post and not get, very, very important, also something to distinguish. And then I'm going to call my input -3. And then if this is not blank, if there is a value, then do something. Simply just echo out this string over here. Then close this off, save this up, make sure our logic is sorted out. 2 lines of code, and that's all you need to pass data through your form. So let's hit back over, and let's refresh this. And I'm going to say Jack is my name. So if I hit submit, we can actually clear this up at the top of here, just to get a feel for what's happening. So let's press enter again. Now I'm going to say Jack again, and Jack gets posted here at the bottom. But take note that unlike the get method, Jack never gets posted into the URL. Why is this? Again, as we mentioned in our previous lesson, when it comes to working with sensitive data, you want to pass that data in the back or the body of your website. In most cases, you won't even be posting that data or printing that data out unless you need to. So details such as credit cards and those kind of things, you can avoid passing through the URL. And the reason for this is because some data is sensitive and you do not need to pass them through the URL. Now, let's work with one last example, and that is the session superglobal. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file over here, and I'm going to name this file. Let's first save this file as a PHP file, and I'll save this as l8-2.php, just so we can distinguish from the others. And I'm going to create another file over here and explain why in a second. And this one is going to be called, as you may imagine, l8-3.php. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to be able to pass data from this page that I created, the second page, to this page over here. So I'm going to close this off because we no longer need this. Now, I'm only going to be working with these 2 scripts. And again, the idea is using that session superglobal, we're able to pass data from one script to another. How do we do this? I'm going to create a PHP tag over here, and I'm going to include something called session_start. And this function allows you to start a session in PHP. We don't have to include any variables. We can also use session unset or session destroy in the event that we want to clear any variables in our session. For the sake of this tutorial, we are not going to do that. Next, I'm going to paste a simple form that I've already created. And this is very much similar to the previous form that we created, where we are working with the post method. We have input 1 over here, and this is simply just going to take in something called username. And that is basically it. And then we have a submit button. And then over here, I'm going to create another PHP tag after I've created my HTML code over here. I'll save this up. And now I need to write my logic. And before we get started with anything else, let's actually just open this up and make sure everything is working wonderfully. So let's just change this to a 2. And this is what the form looks like. Currently, nothing happens because I haven't hooked up the logic. So heading back over to PHP or Atom, I'm going to insert my logic over here, which is going to be if, and as you know, it's going to be is set my post input 1, which is going to be $_post, and the index that I want to reference is going to be input-1. And then I need to hook up my logic. And I'm going to create a session variable over here. So _session. And I'm going to store this variable inside of that. Okay, so over here, I'm simply just going to say input, let's spell this correctly, input-1 is equal to this variable over here. Okay, so let's copy that. We can actually just paste this over here, And let's close that off. So let's just go through this line of code. Here I've created a session variable called input1, or with a reference or keep a value of input-1, and I'm setting that equal to whatever the user is going to pass in here. So whatever data the user passes in here is going to be stored inside of this super global. And then I'm simply just going to go ahead and echo that out. We actually don't even have to echo this out. So let's paste this over here, because when we do redirect the page, we won't even see this echo. So let's save that up. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to include this function called a header. Now, what does this do? This is the equivalent of redirecting your page, or at least the code that I'm going to insert here. I'm going to open up a couple of quotation marks, and I'm going to call location, colon, and this basically takes in a parameter to say the location that I want to redirect to when this button is clicked. Okay, the submit button is clicked. Where do I want to redirect to? I want to redirect to this page over here. So location expects the location word with a colon, and then the location or the script that you would like to navigate to. In my case, it's going to be L8-3.php. Great. Now, with all of the work done over here, we also need to set up the logic over here. And the logic over here is actually very, very, very straightforward. So I'm going to say PHP, and this is just 2 lines of code, believe it or not. Now, we also need to start a session over here because we want to maintain the session state for this website. Keep in mind, we use a session when we want to store variables and logic across various pages within a website. And then I'm going to just simply echo that session variable that I created earlier, which has a key index of input-1. Let's save that, and let's see what happens. So let's refresh this page over here, and I'm going to type in something like Mickey. And when I hit submit, notice that I'm currently on L8-2.php. Once I hit submit, I'm now on my other page, which is L8-3.php, Mickey. Now, why is this important and how is this useful? Think about it like this. When you are working with a login form, for example, or an e-commerce cart, or any page in your website where you need to pass data from one page to the next, session states or session superglobals are really, really good at doing this. So all we've effectively done, we can actually remove this echo over here because we don't necessarily see this, and it's not useful in any way. Clean up our code. And all we've done is we've created a session to take in whatever the user posts in this input over here, and we've set that equal to the session variable. Then we created the header function to redirect us when the user clicks the submit button to take us to this page over here. And I can actually save this and everything should work just fine. And that is basically it, and how we can work with sessions in PHP. Now, when we start working with databases, this is when we are really going to see PHP come to fruition, because currently, as it stands, we've only been working with data and static variables and figures and some computation and so on. But at some point, we want to be able to work with a database. We want to be able to store values in a database so that those values remain. Because keep in mind, all we've been doing is just refreshing a page, losing our data, and so on and so on. What happens if we actually want to store that data? What if we wanted to create a login page or a registration page or a basic shopping cart? All of these things require a database. And this is really, really where the power comes in when we work with PHP. So in our next lesson, we're going to start off working with MySQL databases. So for all of that and more, I hope to see you in the next lesson. Cheers.